right, so you ready to go deep on this one?
Yeah, let's do it.
Today we're diving into a story that's wild. It's got the dark web, cryptocurrency, presidential pardons, and a whole lot of
It's
controversy.
right up our alley.
We're talking about Donald Trump's pardon of Ross Ulbricht, the guy behind the Silk Road, that infamous online marketplace.
Yeah, I remember when that whole thing went down.
What makes this pardon so eyebrow-raising?
Yeah.
Especially coming from a president who, built his image on being tough on crime, is that Ulbricht wasn't facing some minor charge. We're talking 2 life sentences plus 40 years.
2 life sentences plus 40 years. For operating a website, this is where the whole libertarian argument comes in. To understand the pardon, you have to understand Silk Road. And to understand Silk Road, you got to wrap your head around the dark web.
Okay, so break it down for us. What is the dark web exactly? It sounds kind of like something out of a spy movie.
It kind of is. It's like a hidden part of the internet. You can't access it with like regular browsers. You need special software. And it's designed for anonymity. Think of it as a digital speakeasy. So on the dark web, there was this site called Silk Road, and it was basically eBay for anything illegal. Drugs were the main attraction, but you could find all sorts of stuff, weapons, stolen data, you name it, and all transactions were done with Bitcoin, which back then was pretty new and, made it hard to trace payments.
So it was like the Wild West of the internet, totally unregulated. And Ulbricht was the sheriff. Or maybe more like the outlaw kingpin, depending on how you look at it.
Exactly. He went by the name Dread Pirate Roberts, which, fun fact, is a character from The Princess Bride, a movie about, outlaws and adventure. Anyway, Ulbricht was incredibly skilled at building this anonymous marketplace and, keeping it hidden from the authorities. But eventually the FBI caught up with him. And the charges were heavy: drug trafficking, money laundering, hacking. They even alleged he tried to hire hitmen, though that was never proven.
Wow, a real digital gangster. But way back up for a sec. You mentioned libertarianism. What does that have to do with any of this?
Okay, so libertarians believe in very limited government. They're all about individual freedom and personal responsibility. Minimal government intervention in markets. And you guessed it, minimal regulation online. They saw Ulbricht as a symbol of this fight against overreach. Someone who was providing a service that people wanted, even if it was illegal. They argued that it was the user's choices to buy and sell on Silk Road, and Ulbricht shouldn't be held responsible for their actions.
So they're saying it was a free market. Even if the market was for, illegal stuff. I can see how that's a controversial stance. And Trump aligning himself with this view is pretty interesting given his past stance on law and order.
Right, and that's what makes this pardon so intriguing. Not only did Trump pardon Ulbricht, but he went a step further and actually campaigned on it during his 2024 run, explicitly promising to pardon him if elected. He even called Ulbricht's conviction a grave injustice and the prosecutors scum, which let's just say isn't typical presidential language.
It definitely throws a wrench into the whole law and order image he's cultivated. So what do we make of this? Was it purely a political calculation to appeal to libertarian voters? A genuine belief in Ulbricht's innocence? Or maybe both?
Well, the timing of the pardon is pretty telling. It happened on his very first day back in office, completely bypassing the usual Department of Justice review process.
That's a bold move, to say the least. Kind of makes you wonder what his true motivations were.
It does, and that's what we're going to unpack as we dive deeper into this story. We'll explore the various perspectives on Silk Road, the potential consequences of this pardon, and whether it sets a dangerous precedent for the future of online marketplaces and the dark web.
So what's your initial take on this pardon? Do you think it was justified? Was Ulbricht a victim of government overreach, a dangerous criminal? Or somewhere in between?
It's not a simple answer, and that's what makes this case so fascinating. It challenges us to think about the balance between individual freedom and societal safety.
Yeah, it definitely raises a lot of questions. But before we jump into all that, let's take a closer look at Silk Road itself. Just how big was this operation? And what made it so successful? Or dangerous, depending on your perspective.
Well, it was massive. We're talking millions of users worldwide, hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions. It really was the Amazon of drug sites, as the FBI called it.
Wow, the Amazon of drug sites.
Yeah.
That paints a pretty vivid picture. Let's dig into that next.
So to give you a sense of just how massive this thing was, at its peak, Silk Road was facilitating over $1 million in transactions per day.
Yeah, that's not exactly chump change. It's no wonder the FBI went to such lengths to shut it down.
Yeah.
But, thinking about those users, those millions of people logging on to buy and sell illegal stuff, I'm kind of curious about what drew them to Silk Road in the first place.
Well, it wasn't just the anonymity and the wide selection of products. Those are certainly factors. A lot of users were actually drawn to the idea of a free market operating outside of government control. Remember, this was back in 2011. Bitcoin was still in its early days. And the whole concept of a decentralized, unregulated marketplace was really appealing to some people.
So for some users,
Yeah.
it was almost a philosophical thing, like a statement against the system.
Exactly. They saw it as a way to exercise their individual liberty and, make transactions without interference from the government or banks. Of course, the fact that they were buying and selling illegal goods complicated things a bit.
Right, because even if you believe in a free market, most people would agree that there need to be some limits, especially when it comes to things like drugs and weapons.
Absolutely. And that's where the whole debate about the role of government comes in. How do you balance individual freedom with the need to protect society from harm? And how do you regulate something? As decentralized and anonymous as the dark web, these are tough questions, and there are no easy answers.
It's almost like Silk Road was this test case, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the digital age and kind of forcing us to confront these fundamental questions about freedom regulation and the limits of law enforcement.
Right. And pardon just adds another layer of complexity to all of this, because now you have a former president who campaigned on law and order, pardoning someone who is essentially running a black market empire.
Yeah, it's definitely a head-scratcher. And it's not like this was just a spur-of-the-moment decision. Trump repeatedly defended Ulbricht and even compared his case to his own legal battles, claiming that they were both victims of a deep state conspiracy.
It's fascinating how he framed it as a fight against government overreach, drawing parallels between Ulbricht's situation and his own. It was a clever way to connect with voters who felt disillusioned with the government, particularly those who were already sympathetic to the libertarian perspective.
And you can't deny it was a politically savvy move. By pardoning Ulbricht, Trump solidified his support among libertarians and other groups who view the government with suspicion. It was a clear signal that he was on their side, even if it meant going against his own party's traditional stance on law and order.
It also created quite a stir in the media. Conservative outlets mostly praised the pardon, highlighting Ulbricht's remorse and the perceived injustice of his sentence. Liberal media, on the other hand, condemned it, focusing on the dangers of Silk Road and the potential for Ulbricht to reoffend.
It's a classic example of how a single event can be interpreted in completely different ways, depending on your political perspective.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the broader issue of polarization in our society. People are increasingly retreating into their own echo chambers, consuming information that confirms their existing beliefs, and dismissing anything that challenges them.
Okay, so we've talked about Silk Road, we've talked about libertarianism, we've touched on the media reaction to the pardon. But what about the legal implications? Did Trump overstep his authority by issuing this pardon? And what kind of precedent does this set for future presidents?
Well, the presidential pardon power is pretty broad. The Constitution gives the president the power to grant pardons for federal offenses, and there are very few limits on how that power can be used.
So technically, he was within his rights to pardon Ulbricht.
Yeah, legally speaking, there's no question about that. But many legal scholars argue that even if something is legal, it doesn't necessarily mean it's ethical or in the best interests of the country. And in this case, there are concerns that Trump may have abused his pardon power for political gain.
You're talking about the quid pro quo aspect, right?
Yeah.
Where he basically promised the pardon in exchange for political support.
Exactly. A quid pro quo, which literally means something for something, can be considered a form of bribery. And that raises serious ethical and legal questions.
Right. It's like he was using the pardon power as a bargaining chip rather than a tool for justice.
And that undermines the whole purpose of the pardon power, which is supposed to be about mercy and forgiveness, not political maneuvering.
But even setting aside the ethical questions, there are practical concerns as well, right? Like, what about the message this sends to criminals? If they know they can get a pardon from a sympathetic president, does that make them more likely to break the law?
That's a valid concern. It's called recidivism, the tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend. And there's definitely a risk that pardons like this could embolden criminals, especially if they believe they can get away with it.
It's a slippery slope, for sure. And it's not just a hypothetical concern. We've already seen cases where people pardoned by Trump ended up back in trouble with the law.
Right. Jesse Benton is a prime example. He was a Republican political operative pardoned by Trump in 2020 for a campaign finance violation. And then just a few years later, he was convicted again on charges of illegally funneling money from a Russian national to Trump's 2016 campaign.
Wow. So not only did he get a pardon, but he went on to commit a crime that potentially helped Trump get elected in the first place. It's almost too ironic to be true.
It certainly highlights the potential pitfalls
Yeah.
of pardoning people without a thorough vetting process.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The background of Silk Road, the libertarian perspective, the political motivations behind pardon, the media reaction, the legal implications, and even the issue of recidivism. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to discuss, and it's a big one, the January 6th Capitol riot. You see, Trump's pardon of Ulbricht wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of controversial pardons, including pardons for many people involved in the insurrection.
And that's where things get even more complicated, because now you're not just talking about individual crimes and pardons, you're talking about an attack on democracy itself.
Well, we're talking about a president who pardoned the mastermind behind a massive online black market, and then turned around and pardoned people who stormed the Capitol building, trying to overturn the election. It paints a pretty chaotic picture, don't you think?
It certainly raises questions about his motivations and his understanding of the rule of law.
Exactly. Like, was he genuinely trying to right perceived wrongs? Or was he just rewarding his loyal supporters, regardless of their crimes?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think it's important to remember that Trump has always viewed himself as an outsider, someone who's fighting against a corrupt system, and that us versus them mentality definitely played a role in his pardon decisions.
So he saw himself as the champion of the forgotten man, the guy who was going to shake things up and drain the swamp. And I guess in his mind, pardoning people like Ulbricht and the January 6th rioters was a way of sticking it to the establishment, the people he believed were persecuting him and his supporters.
It's a populist strategy that's been used by politicians throughout history, appealing to people's sense of grievance. Their feeling that they've been wronged by the system is a powerful way to build a loyal following.
And it worked for Trump, at least to some extent. He tapped into a deep vein of anger and resentment, and he channeled it into political power.
But that kind of power can be dangerous, especially when it's wielded without restraint or regard for the consequences.
So where does this leave us? We have a pardoned Silk Road kingpin, a bunch of pardoned insurrectionists, and a deeply divided country struggling to make sense of it all. What's the takeaway here? What's the lesson we should be learning from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we need to be more aware of the dangers of unchecked power. When a single individual has the ability to pardon criminals without any oversight or accountability, it creates a system that's ripe for abuse.
And it erodes trust in our institutions. If people believe that the justice system is rigged, that the president can just pardon his friends and allies whenever he wants, it undermines the whole foundation of our democracy.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have a robust system of checks and balances to ensure that no one person has too much power.
Checks and balances, transparency, accountability. Those are all essential ingredients for a healthy democracy.
And a healthy dose of critical thinking. We need to be more discerning about the information we consume, more willing to question our own biases, and more engaged in the political process.
Well said. Because at the end of the day, we're all responsible for the future of our country. We can't just sit back and expect someone else to fix things for us.
Exactly. We need to be informed, engaged citizens who are willing to hold our leaders accountable and demand better.
Okay, so wrapping things up, this deep dive into the Silk Road pardon has been a wild ride. It's a story that touches on everything, from the dark web and cryptocurrency to presidential power and the fragility of democracy.
It's a story that challenges us to think critically about the complex issues facing our society and to consider the unintended consequences of seemingly simple actions.
And it's a story that's still unfolding. Who knows what the long-term impact of these pardons will be? Only time will tell.
But one thing's for sure, it's a story that will continue to be debated and discussed for years to come.
Absolutely. So as always, keep those minds churning. And we'll catch you on the next deep dive. We'll explore another fascinating topic that's sure to keep you on the edge of your seat. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep